hear Dianne Herman talk about barriers to voting. Thanks for coming. It's great to have you here. It is very different than being in person. I'm Elizabeth Schmidt with Wright Library, and Brian Potts is also with Wright Library. He's going to be behind the scenes. This Let's Talk presentation on barriers to voting is part of our series on bringing people together to talk about important issues, and barriers to voting is definitely an important issue, especially this year with the pandemic and a presidential election, just so many things to talk about. During the presentation, we do invite you to pose questions in either chat or the Q&A. You can find those at the bottom of your screen. We'll wait and answer questions at the end of the presentation. And so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to introduce Dianne Herman. She is with the League of Women Voters, and she's here today to talk about barriers to voting. So I'm going to turn it over to Dianne. Thank you so much for coming, Dianne.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to Wright Memorial Library. And good evening, everyone. The United States created the world's first written national constitution, and we are the oldest living democratic republic. But when the US Constitution was written, the founders provided little guidance about rules for voting, leaving this responsibility mainly to the states, but with the caveat that Congress would have the authority to override state election laws. Initially, most states limited the vote to white males with property, but over time, the property requirement was dropped as pressures to extend democratic rights more widely was adopted, especially with the expansion of the frontier and the addition of the Western states. Then the principle of the need for the consent of the government was argued by the suffragists. They won the right to vote for women in 1920 after US involvement in World War I, when President Wilson said we were fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy. Alice Paul responded, well, then let women vote. And then the norms and values of our political system were challenged with the civil rights movement, with values of political equality and equal protection of the laws were advanced. So that in 1962, the Supreme Court in Baker versus Carr argued that we should have one person, one vote. And then Congress passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This principle of equal protection expanded the electorate to include racial minorities, especially African Americans in the South, who had long suffered voter suppression through the poll tax system, literacy tests, the white primary, you can look that up in Google, and racial terrorism, such as lynching. And after the controversy over the Vietnam War, the voting age was changed from 21 to 18. If 18-year-olds could be drafted to fight in a war, Americans reasoned that 18-year-olds should be allowed to vote. So that actually we have 5 amendments to the US Constitution that deal with voting rights. The first was the 15th Amendment, which after the Civil War extended the franchise to African American males. Now, this held for a very brief period during Reconstruction, but after the institution of Jim Crow laws, African Americans were not really eligible to vote until 1965 due to repressive tactics. Then we have the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which allowed for direct election of senators. This was passed during the progressive movement. Then the 19th Amendment, through the efforts of the suffragists, enfranchised females technically, but actually white females until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then the 24th Amendment, which prohibits poll taxes. And then finally, the 26th Amendment, which enfranchises 18-year-olds. So there have been several attempts to expand the franchise so that more citizens could vote over the years. And that's reflected in these additions to our Constitution. The latest reform attempt is to address the disenfranchisement of felons. Now, Ohio does allow persons who have felony convictions to vote, but there are 8 states that bar anyone convicted of a felony, that bar them from voting. And in 2010, this impacted nearly 6 million Americans, overwhelmingly minorities, who were barred from voting due to a past criminal conviction. Through voter initiative, Florida has recently enfranchised felons, but the state legislature has erected additional barriers by requiring payment of fines and court costs. But today, the United States ranks toward the bottom of developed democracies in terms of voter turnout. Apathy and cynicism certainly contribute, and the quality of candidates can discourage voters. Independents, for example, are the largest category of voters, indicating voter disenfranchisement with both major political parties. And the quality of civic education in the United States is also a problem. Almost 2/3 of Americans are not able to identify the 3 branches of the federal government. And research shows that those with less knowledge of how the political system works tend to vote less than those with more knowledge. But there are also some other barriers we have imposed to voting, which have resulted in creating hurdles for those who wish to participate in our democratic system. There are some in our country who believe that not everybody should vote. Ann Coulter, for example, doesn't believe that women should vote. And some who believe that voting should be a privilege and not a right. But if you believe that the health of our democracy greatly depends on an informed citizenry who is actively engaged, then these artificial constraints on participation are a concern, for they undermine the legitimacy of our system. And here comes the plug. That is the mission of the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization that works to increase public understanding of major public policy issues and that influences public policy through advocacy, so that not only does the League encourage voting, but also works to encourage voters to do so intelligently. So let's look at some of these barriers to voting. First one we're going to look at is registering to vote. One of the activities of the League of Women Voters has always been to assist citizens in registering to vote, which is the first thing you need to do to vote in most states. There's only one state, North Dakota, that doesn't require pre-registration. So this is understandable, given the history of the League of Women Voters, that they would be focused on voter registration, because the League was founded the same year as women won the right to vote in 1920. And one of its primary functions when it was first formed was to teach women how to exercise their newly won franchise. Since then, the League has historically engaged in voter registration drives and has advanced legislation such as the National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Act, which expanded places where citizens could register to vote, such as Department of Motor Vehicles offices, and also allow citizens to register to vote by mail. But states can impose restrictions on voter registration drives, and the state of Florida, not to beat too much up on Florida, has a history of attempting to discourage such initiatives, starting in 2006 and involving several lawsuits over several years. The state of Florida has passed laws that have produced a chilling effect on registration drives. These include extremely burdensome administrative requirements, unreasonably tight deadlines for submission of completed forms, and heavy penalties for even the slightest delay or mistake. These restrictions, while challenged in court, and some have been found to be unconstitutional, have been so unnecessarily harsh that from time to time, the League of Women Voters of Florida has suspended its voter registration drives. Another problem is something called the exact match. This example comes from the state of Georgia. Just before the 2018 election, the Secretary of State of Georgia, who's responsible for enforcing voting laws, held up 53,000 voter registrations, largely from African-American voters. Under Georgia law, the voter registration application is complete only if the form matches exactly records kept by the Georgia Department of Driver Services or the Social Security Administration. If there is no match, the applicant is to be notified by mail and given an opportunity to provide more information. The problem is that it's not uncommon for exact matches to not occur. You can have junior, senior, surnames, hyphenated names, accent marks, the absence or presence of a middle initial. And the Secretary of State, who is Brian Kemp, was also running for governor of Georgia at the time. So this was quite a controversial issue. Okay, let's look at voter identification. After you register to vote, then you show up at the polls, right? And while nearly half of Americans believe voter fraud happens at least somewhat often, and 70% thinks it happens occasionally, academic studies repeatedly find that this is an exceedingly rare occurrence. It sounds logical, though, and entirely appropriate that citizens should be required to prove their identity in order to vote. And in fact, the 2002 Help America Vote Act, which the League of Women Voters strongly supported, requires citizens to show some sort of identification in order to vote. But this law allowed identifications such as a utility bill, bank statement, or Social Security card to serve as forms of identification in order to vote. The problem comes in when states require state-issued photo identifications that, even if offered for free, can only be obtained by providing documents that may be hard to obtain or costly to obtain, and which African Americans and other minorities, young people, the elderly, and the poor are least likely to have. Requiring people to travel to locations issuing state identifications can also amount to a poll tax, where the cost of transportation for poor people can be a financial barrier. Also, I love the story that Carol Alexander tells about the impossible bind that faced residents of Marion County, Indiana, that's Indianapolis, where a significant number of the state's Black population lives, when people attempted to obtain a birth certificate as one of their proofs of identity. They could only obtain that if they had a driver's license. So this was a catch-22 for the voters in Indiana. In addition, studies have shown that in some states, such as Georgia, Department of Motor Vehicle offices are disproportionately located in more affluent and white areas of the state, and only a few are accessible through public transportation. After Wisconsin passed a new voter identification law, Governor Scott Walker curtailed the operating hours and removed many of the DMVs in the Democratic stronghold of Milwaukee, where 70% of the state's Black population lives. Unfortunately, this is not a rare case. After passing its new voter identification law, Alabama closed 33 driver's license offices, mostly in Black counties, or limited the operating hours to a few days per week. In North Dakota, a new voter ID law was passed after the 2012 election, in which there was a narrow upset victory of Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp winning that election. This new law disenfranchised many Native Americans because the new law required ID that displayed a current residential street address. But this is a requirement that many Native Americans could not meet because many live in remote areas and they don't have a residential street address. They use post office box addresses on their IDs. And the courts have upheld this requirement, although there was a pretty significant voter registration drive to try to get residential streets addresses assigned for Native Americans. In some states, choosing to ignore some types of state-issued identifications can be clearly discriminatory, such as Alabama refusing to accept state-issued public housing identification, and Texas, which recognizes state-issued gun licenses, but not state-issued University of Texas college identifications. It's a little wonder then that studies show that strict voter identification laws that require state-issued ID have a discriminatory effect, especially for minority communities and poor people. Not surprisingly, strict voter identification laws with restrictions on ways to obtain state-issued identifications result in lower voter turnout. So now let's look at voter roll purges, something that Ohioans may be familiar with. The 1993 National Voter Registration Act mandated that election officials update the voter rolls regularly. Well, this just seems like common sense, especially when the number of registered voters exceeds the population of an election district due to people dying or moving out of the area, so that voters can get concerned that this is an opening for election fraud. It's not so hot when the people on the voter rolls outnumber the people who actually reside in the county. So this can be a problem. But updating voter rolls has been a controversial issue for several years, as instances of sloppy record keeping, bureaucratic malfeasance and incompetence, and political manipulation have resulted in a number of election day fiascos. One of the classic ones occurred in the 2000 election in St. Louis City, where nearly 50,000 names from key Democratic precincts were illegally purged prior to their election by the city boards of elections, causing chaos at the polls and resulting in the disenfranchisement of thousands of voters who were legally registered to vote. While expressly forbidden in federal law, states have used the criteria of not voting as a way to remove a voter from the rolls. Ohio, in particular, has been criticized for its aggressive removal of 2 million voters from the state's list of registered voters from the period 2011 to 2016. 2 million voters purged in 5 years. When Ohio updated its election laws in 1994, it stated that voters may be purged from the rolls if they had not voted in 2 federal elections within 6 years. And then not responding to a mailing from the Board of Election and then not voting for 4 years after that. In 2016, a lawsuit resulted, Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute. This court case was filed when a veteran who hadn't voted in the past few federal elections was denied his right to vote because he had been purged from the rolls, unbeknownst, he says to him, saying he never received notification. While a federal appeals court panel ruled that the Ohio's process of purging voter rolls was illegal, the US Supreme Court found the process constitutional because the state had sent postcards to infrequent voters who were about to be removed from the rolls, notifying them to update their registrations. The majority on the court said that Ohio's system doesn't remove a voter only or solely because they didn't vote. Instead, the removal is for not voting and not answering the postcard. The process used by Ohio to update its voter registration rolls has been criticized as being antiquated, relying on voter information from Ohio's 88 boards of elections, and also one of the most aggressive voter removal systems in the country. Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose, while critical of some aspects of the system, nevertheless has argued that it is his responsibility to keep the rolls current by Ohio law, and he has to follow the process in Ohio law. But he did something a little different. This past summer in 2019, the county boards of elections turned in a list of 235,000 registrations targeted for removal by LaRose. But unlike other secretaries of state, LaRose chose to share this list with voting rights groups such as the League of Women Voters, which work to find those voters and get them to update their registrations. In the process, the League discovered more than 4,000 voters who had voted in recent elections, their registration was current, but had been removed from the rolls mistakenly, mainly due to no uniform process, which is a violation of the law actually, and poor maintenance and database management. What about access to the polls? When polling places are disproportionately placed or limited by number, especially in areas where minorities, students, and poor people reside, the effect is that voters must tolerate hours of waiting in long lines to vote. Some may become discouraged or may not be able to wait because of work or family commitments, and thus they become disenfranchised. The recent problems faced by Wisconsin voters is illustrative in their most recent primary election, with voters waiting in long lines during a pandemic, of all things, possibly resulting in new infections. And in fact, there was one case documented of a poll worker becoming infected as a result. As a way to address long lines on election day, some states have adopted early voting or absentee voting by mail, or simply all mail voting. But some states, such as Alabama, have no early voting, and they require the voter to be out of state at the time of the election or have a disability or illness that prevents the voter from being able to physically be present at the polls in order to be eligible for absentee ballots. Due to its many restrictions on voting, actually, Alabama has earned the distinction of being one of the hardest states in which to vote. Ohio adopted early voting after a disastrous election that was very embarrassing in 2004, in which there was polling place chaos and long lines that lasted until the early morning hours. After that, Ohio instituted 35 days of early voting, which proved to be very successful in reducing waits at the polls. But since then, Ohio has reduced early voting and restricted its use on weekends and evening hours. And I'm going to mention in a minute something that's before the Ohio legislature regarding this. And Ohio has also been criticized for only allowing one location per county for early voting, regardless of geographical or population concerns. Now let's turn to gerrymandering. The US Constitution required that legislative boundaries be drawn every decade after the census to align congressional districts with population shifts and changes. And it leaves the drawing of districts to the states and their legislatures. This can result in state politicians drawing districts to their advantage. In fact, it didn't take long for the politicians to figure this out, as witnessed the first case of boundary manipulation by Elbridge Gerry, governor of Massachusetts in 1810, who drew a district the shape of a salamander to corral his rivals, neutralize their influence, which the press termed a gerrymander, a tactic that has been used with great zeal by both parties since then. And gerrymandering has been a problem for some time in Ohio, as in most states. But gerrymandering has been practiced by both Republicans and Democrats when they've been in control. However, there was a significant controversy over the redistricting process in Ohio after the 2010 census, with some accusing the Republican legislature of using gerrymandering tactics to create an electoral advantage for their party when they drew boundaries for Ohio State House of Representatives districts. And you can see our current congressional map up on the left. Most notorious was District 9, which you can see up at the top. This is known as the snake along the lake. This district is a thin area skirting Lake Erie and encompassing 5 counties: Lucas, Ottawa, Erie, Lorain, and Cuyahoga. But due to the amount of criticism and mobilization of good government groups, including the League of Women Voters of Ohio, in November 2015, Ohio voters resoundingly, over 71% yes vote, approved Issue 1, reforming Ohio's process for redistricting the Ohio General Assembly. And you can see on one side the current congressional map, and that's what a highly gerrymandered state looks like. And then on the right, what it looks like when it's ungerrymandered. The reform in Issue 1 ends the partisan process for drawing the state's congressional districts and replaces it with a transparent and public process which promotes bipartisanship, keeps local communities intact, and has compact district boundaries. Currently, Ohio has 16 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. And while Ohio voters are almost evenly split in voters registered in either the Republican or the Democratic parties, 12 of the 16 members of U.S. Congress are Republican, and only 4 are members of the Democratic Party. While reform has been accomplished to address gerrymandering of Ohio's legislative districts, these are Ohio legislative districts, still to be addressed is the way that Ohio will draw district boundaries for Ohio's representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. And one major effect of gerrymandering is to inflate the representation in Congress of the political party that has control of the legislature when district boundaries are drawn. So that Republican control of state houses and governorships in 26 states after the 2010 census resulted in Democrats running for seats in the U.S. House of Representatives receiving 1.4 million more votes than their opponents, but Republicans securing 33 more seats. In addition, some states, such as Tennessee, have a history of not updating their congressional districts to reflect population changes and using formulas that have historically favored rural areas over urban ones, so that by 1960 in Tennessee, 2/3 of Tennessee's representatives were being elected by 1/3 of the state's population. Indeed, the malapportionment issue was raised in the classic Supreme Court case Baker versus Carr, in which the court ruled that states cannot dilute the votes of some citizens while privileging others, as this would be a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Hence, the court defined one person, one vote as the standard benchmark for democracy. Another effect of gerrymandering is to create what are known as safe districts, where there's little to no competition between the parties, creating a system where the politicians pick the voters and not the other way around. And this can lead to voter apathy and cynicism, as it appears that the result of the election is a foregone conclusion. And indeed, gerrymandering has a negative effect on voter behavior. Those in competitive districts are more likely to vote. Those in safe, uncompetitive districts stay home more often on election day. Additional negative effects on our democracy from gerrymandering include calcification of the system. Over 90% of incumbents in the US House of Representatives won re-election. And gerrymandering also creates, with these in conjunction with the safe districts, creates extreme polarization in the political parties, which results in legislatures hardening of their political positions and refusing to compromise. Well, what would politics be without money? And so let's talk about dark money. In 1975, the Watergate Congress enacted a system of public financing for presidential campaigns. And in 2002, after 5 years of trying, bipartisan legislation by Senators McCain and Feingold capped large financial contributions that had come to dominate political campaigns. But public financing soon became outdated as candidates shunned these sources of funds because the amount was not sufficient to allow them to be competitive. And then in 2010, the US Supreme Court, in the Citizens United decision, allowed for unlimited election spending by corporations and individuals, so that in 2012, Sheldon Anderson spent at least $93 million on behalf of Republican candidates. And Democratic presidential campaigns of Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer were launched when they used huge amounts of their own money. In the Supreme Court ruling, it was noted that their ruling would not be corrosive of our system, they argued, because there would be public disclosure of donations. But this isn't exactly accurate, because donors can give to organizations that, as long as they say they are charitable or nonprofit advocacy groups, can hide the names of their contributors. If the rich can buy elections, voters may come to see the process as corrupt and the political system as rigged and not legitimate. So, how do we do it right? Well, registering to vote, while we certainly want to see some guidelines so that organizations who conduct voter registration drives are doing so in good faith, imposing extremely restrictive and punitive laws for organizations that assist voters in registering to vote should be avoided. What about voter identification? Well, we actually have a fairly good system of voter ID in Ohio. It allows a voter to provide an ID, which can include a state-issued identification or driver's license, but our identification requirements are broader than simply state-issued ones. In Ohio, for example, a voter can provide a bank statement, utility bill, or payroll check, as long as it has the address on it, as permissible forms of identification in order to register to vote and to vote. What about voter roll purges? It's entirely appropriate for states to keep their voter rolls up to date. But you have to do it right. The League has called on the Ohio General Assembly to pass more stringent uniform standards for counties so that the maintenance of their databases are accurate and that they implement strict quality control uniform protocols. Access to the polls. Expansion of early voting, no-fault absentee voting, and voting by mail are possible solutions. And we'll be talking about voting by mail. I know we'll have some questions on that, as that's a current controversy in our chat session. But voting by mail or early voting and no-fault absentee voting are ways in which we can increase access to the polls. Secretary of State LaRose has advocated for Ohio to allow voters to apply for absentee ballots online instead of the current system of having to complete a form and mailing it in. And he also supports automatically sending every registered voter in the state an absentee ballot request form with a postage paid response. Expansion of the number of early voting locations is also encouraged. We find, for example, when there are multiple early voting sites, participation increases. In Indiana, for example, counties with multiple early voting sites had over a 60% increase in early voting. And what about gerrymandering? Ohio should institute a similar process that Ohio voters approved in issue 1, where we reformed how Ohio draws its state legislative districts, and uses a transparent bipartisan redistricting process with community safeguards on district boundaries. What about dark money? Well, we'll never get rid of the corrupting influence of money in politics. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but we can do some things to curb its excesses. The most important to me is transparency. If someone wants to contribute millions to a political campaign, that's fine, but voters should know about it. Removing the ability of individuals and groups to hide their contributions needs to be addressed. Also, some states have come up with some novel ideas. In New York City, for example, small contributions can receive a taxpayer match while still allowing candidates to use other sources of funds. But one thing we know for sure, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires vigilance and public awareness to avoid having it undermined. Remember, politics is too important to just leave to the politicians. So now we'll talk about some questions, comments, concerns. Somebody had a question, I think, about mail-in voting. It's been used, I think, for over 5 years now in Oregon. There are 5 states, I think there's 5 states that allow for all mail-in voting. And so far, the reviews, and they've been in red states and blue states. Oregon's one, Utah's the other. And the voters really like it. It seems to work pretty well. The problem comes in because if it's all mail-in voting, you have to have somebody verify that signature. That's usually the way it's documented, that it's a legitimate ballot. There's verification, and there's machines that do that, but they're expensive. And also it requires printing lots of ballots ahead of time. If you go to vote, for example, at your polls in Ohio, it's all computerized. This way, with mail-in ballots, you have to print the ballots ahead of time and then mail those out. So that's another sort of glitch that can occur in the system when you move to all mail voting. There's some cost savings that you get from not having polls operating and paying poll workers, but there's costs to documenting the ballots, verifying the ballots, and the cost of the ballots and being mailed too. So those, it's kind of pick your poison, whichever one is going to cost you. So just those are my comments on mail-in voting. If we have any other concerns, I'll address those.
Diane, we do have a question. Have you seen the documentary film Rigged, the voter suppression playbook? And if so, what is your opinion of that documentary?
I haven't seen that. Is it, what's the source of the documentary? Did they mention that?
I don't know. Mark posed that question. The documentary is called Rigged, the voter suppression playbook.
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay.
But I did want to mention also something that just came up in the Dayton Daily News. This is pending right now in the Ohio Senate, I believe. The progress of Ohio House Bill 680, which includes provisions for the upcoming election, which are different than those planned by LaRose, our Secretary of State, who he's the person in charge of our elections, and calling for expansion of early voting, which LaRose has called for. The law change would eliminate in-person early voting on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday before Tuesday, November 3rd's election. Those early voting times have been offered since 2012. So this is a rollback of some days of early voting. It would also end the mailing of unsolicited absentee ballot applications to all registered voters, which has been done since 2008 and which Secretary LaRose strongly supports. So that's just for citizen information. You can contact your legislature about that. House Bill 680.
Another question is, I grew up in a state with open primaries. Has Ohio ever had open primaries? Has there been any interest in making Ohio primaries open instead of strict division by party or issues only?
Actually, there was a study done a couple of years ago by the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and to review Ohio's system of primary elections. The issue of primary elections started with the progressive era because it used to be, remember the old adage of guys in the back room, smoke-filled back room, picking the politicians. So the progressives instituted the primary system whereby the voters decide who the candidates are to represent their party. Ohio's system is an open system in that if you, in some states, you have to declare your party affiliation even as you register to vote. You don't have to do that in Ohio. You just register to vote. You don't declare a party. In New York, you have to do that, New York State. In Ohio, therefore, on primary day, you go to the polls, and primaries are the elections in which the citizens determine the candidate from their political party that they want to run in the general election against the opposing party. Well, in Ohio, you can present yourself at election day, primary election day, and you can, even if you voted before in the Democratic Party, if at this particular time you want to vote in the Republican primary, you can just say, I want a Republican ballot. If you don't want to get involved in party politics, either selecting the nominee from the party that it could be the Green Party, Libertarian Party, Republican or Democratic Party, whichever party, if you don't want to deal with the party politics, then you just ask for an issues only ballot, and then you just vote the issues instead of determining who the candidate is from political party. But you can't vote in both the Republican and the Democratic primaries, obviously. You have to pick one. Did that answer your question?
Well, I guess he'll let us know. There is a note here from Colleen Kelsey that the documentary that was referenced, Rigged, the voter suppression playbook, is available on Amazon Prime if anyone else would like to check that out. And I see that Colleen has a question. I'm going to unmute you, Colleen.
Hi, Colleen. Go ahead.
Oh, let me try again. Let's see. Can you talk now, Colleen?
Yeah, there must be a confusion because that was someone else's question. I don't know why it came up as me. So.
Oh, okay. Did you raise your hand? Did you have a question?
No, I didn't.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Any other questions? You can raise your hand or just write in the chat.
The mail-in ballot issue, by the way, my uncle is a political science professor, so this nerdiness with politics runs in our family. But he was just asked about the mail-in ballots, and he thinks that the Republican Party is actually making a big mistake by questioning voter fraud issues regarding mail-in ballots. First of all, there's no evidence to suggest that there's significant fraud with any form of voting, including mail-in ballots. And we have, like I said before, we have states that have used all mail-in systems for several years now, and there hasn't seemed to be a major issue with fraud. But my uncle, Richard Murray, Professor Murray from University of Houston, says that actually this was a reform that was introduced by the Republicans because it actually favors the constituency most likely to vote Republican, which is generally more affluent people and older voters, and they prefer mail-in ballots. So they're used to using them, and they use them with confidence. He thinks that they may be kind of undermining their own constituency, which seems kind of self-defeating. A friend of mine just voted the first time in Pennsylvania this week by mail, and she was very complimentary about the system. Most people who use the mail-in system really like it. I have actually never done it. I've done early voting. That's my preferred way of voting, but I'm going to try mailing this time, especially given the issues that we're having with safety with the virus. So we'll see how that goes.
Colleen, I have a question. How close do you think we are to internet voting? The census just went out, is going on this year, and that is via internet. What do you think the future looks like for internet voting?
Are you asking me, Elizabeth?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Ohio is trying to move to, as I said before, using the internet for online registering. So you don't have to mail, Frank LaRose wants to update us, so, get us into somewhat of the 21st century by allowing registering to vote through the computer, requesting the form. You don't have to, mail it in and stuff. That's the closest we've ventured toward using the internet and voting. I think the mailing system will proceed before we'll move to internet. I think there's, first of all, not everybody has access to internet, especially in the rural areas, so you can't set up a system that's going to disenfranchise people like we've been talking about. So that may be what we'd have to have broadband, universal broadband accessibility to move to that system, I think, and that's going to be a ways off. Plus the technological issues, security issues, hacking, and all that kind of stuff. We're a ways away, I think, technologically to that. The next step is going to be people moving to using mailing more.
Diane, there's another question. I used absentee ballot mail-in this spring. All went well, but I'm concerned that people don't understand the deadlines for mailing in the ballots. Is there a way to make people understand those deadlines? That question is from Barbara.
Yes, that's what the league excels at. Voter education about the voting process. We have Vote 411 to answer any questions. You can always go to your boards of election to get information, your county boards of election. And our county board of election, by the way, in Montgomery County, I want to boast a little bit about them. I think they do an excellent job. But what they found was, for example, when they did move in Oregon to all mail-in voting, it took a while for voters to become educated about the process. So yes, when you do any kind of absentee mailing, voting, and all that kind of stuff, it requires additional voter education, which can be, again, another barrier. So you want to make sure that people understand the process, the deadlines, and all that kind of stuff. And also, there have been issues with our last election with the compressed timelines and the sudden change. There were many people who requested absentee ballots and never received them in Ohio because the deadlines were so short. So you have to institute enough time so that people don't have to turn things around in quick succession. Otherwise, that can cause a problem. So Barbara's absolutely right about that. A lot of voter education needed with mailing voting of any kind, absentee or all mail-in voting.
Diane, Laurel has a question. I've heard concern that the post office may not be able to handle the quantity of mail generated by vote by mail.
That's what happened with
Any thoughts?
really got on the postal service because there was a mess up with that. In this last election, several thousand ballots never made it because there was a delay with the post office. That was another issue. So now the postal service has said that they will do better, and if there's an all mail-in system, and they anticipate, it's widely anticipated that there will be a significant increase, and this is being shown in recent elections, by the way. The number of mail-in votes increased substantially. So the Postal Service has said that they will up their game. So, and of course, that's another issue because the Postal Service is in economic hardship because of the virus and other issues. So, this will require the post office being able to deliver literally. So we'll see.
A question from Shelley. What percentage of mail-in ballots versus in-person voting would it take for states to not be called on the night of the election? How does mail-in voting change, when they can make the decision about the election? Yeah.
On November 3rd, 2020, we will not, this is my prediction, we will not know who the president is for several days and maybe even several weeks, because it's anticipated the mail-in percentage will drastically increase, especially if we have another spike in the virus. This is anticipated to be an issue. So you won't be able to sit up till 1 o'clock at night and know who the president is, probably not going to happen. So that's something we can anticipate. And so people will be biting their nails, I'm sure, to see who won, because it's gonna be a delay in knowing that, probably.
Great. Any other questions? I'm checking the chat and the Q&A. Okay, this is a follow-up to the question about the open primary. I might have used the wrong term in my previous question. Is there an interest in Ohio for a blanket primary? I don't know what that is. Are you familiar with that, Diane?
The blanket primary?
A blanket primary.
Well, the latest reform in primary systems, there's two of them. One happened in Maine, where they used ranked choice voting, and the other, and that just passed last year, at the urging of the League of Women Voters of Maine, actually. And in California, it's called the top two primary, where now that's what you can consider an open primary. Everybody, all the candidates are listed in one ballot, and they can, they'll have their party affiliation listed. But instead of having a Republican primary and a Democratic primary, or a Libertarian primary, Green County Green Party primary. All the candidates are thrown in the same basket on the ballot, and you vote for one. The two candidates who get the most votes then go into the general election. So you could actually have two Democrats running against each other in the general election, which happened with Kamala Harris's Senate campaign, because they had the top two primary. This was instituted just a few years ago. So I don't know if that answers the question. That top two primary, the political scientists are still trying to evaluate the impact of that. It takes several election cycles to evaluate whether a reform is doing what it's anticipated to do. But the top two primary makes a lot of sense in California, because California became essentially a one-party state. The Republican Party has basically become extinct in California, except for in a few rural areas. So, you know, whoever won the Democratic primary automatically wins the election. And there are some negative consequences of that, including increased polarization. So California instituted this reform, so we'll see how that works. I think it's a good idea in a one dominant, when you have a state that's predominantly one party, there's no competition. So this at least allows for some competition in the election. I hope I answered and I don't know what a blanket primary is. If you're interested in primaries, Louisiana has a really quirky system. Each state has its own rules about how they run their elections. And but I like Ohio's system. And when the league evaluated Ohio's primary system, we found that it was a good system, because it allows, if you don't want to vote you want to change your party affiliation, you don't have to go through re-registering or anything like that. You just show up at the polls and you decide, I'm going to vote on this other party. I like this particular candidate better in the other party. So it allows for flexibility and the voters actually deciding who the candidates are. So I like our system in Ohio.
Sounds like you did answer that question.
Okay.
Any other questions? I don't think so. So Dianne, thank you so much for your time today.
Yes,
is there anything that you want to say about the League of Women Voters before people?
Well, if you're interested in voter registration drives, public education, or just strengthening our democracy, I highly encourage you to join the League of Women Voters. Our league in this area represents the League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area, represents Greene and Montgomery counties, but we have members from Miami and Dark and all different counties sometimes join our league. Our Dayton League, I'll brag a little bit, was founded in 1920. It's one of the oldest leagues, local leagues, and ours is one of the largest leagues in the country. We have over 300 members, and we're very active in the community. So I think the league is a great way to volunteer if you're so inclined.
Great, thanks so much, Dianne.
Thank you
for coming, and have a good night.